In the world of preamps, you typically have two worlds, simplified, but you have clean preamps and you have color preamps. Very rarely is there one that can do both. Maybe there's ones that have options, but they're not like perfectly clean preamps. All the perfectly clean preamps are only do clean. We're talking about the really high-end transformerless preamps that exist, very expensive but lovely, especially on like ribbon mics and something like an SM7B, something where you need a low noise floor. They're great, And then you have the world of the color preamps, which are typically the opposite. They add color, right? So they add pleasing harmonic distortion. They're not transparent. They're not clean, but you don't want clean. You want them to add vibe. But there's no preamp really that does both equally well. There's nothing that does like a perfect, clean signal with the ability to add a transformer or tube style saturation. And similarly, there's no tube or transformer device that can do a perfectly transformerless preamp until the Camden came along. So the thing with the Camden is we want to do both. Now the thing is the mojo is very subjective. So whether you think we did a good job on our transformer and tube saturation circuit, mojo circuit, I'll go into more what those are. That's a subjective thing. But objectively speaking, we can talk about the Camden's clean performance because we have science. We have audio analysis. We have, the nice thing about seeing how clean a preamp is it's objective. You can run it through an audio analyzer and you can find out for yourself. And that's what we'll do on this call today. But so we want to make a really clean preamp as well. And we didn't maybe realize just how good of a job this man right here would do on making a really clean preamp. I mean, it meets or exceeds the cleanest preamps in the world, but for like half the price. And then also has all those color options. So it's become a very popular preamp. I think we have something like 12,000 channels of them out in the field now of Camdens between the Camden 500, Camden EC1, Camden EC2. So, and that's in 5 years. So it's the message has gotten out about how versatile and high performance the Camden is, because in both modes, whether using it as a clean mode, for people who do orchestral recordings and stuff like that, it's an elite performing preamp when you want clean performance. But then for people like, vocalists at home or guitars and stuff like that, Thump and Cream add some really interesting analog saturation, reminiscent of tube, valve, tape saturation, transformer style gear. So that was the idea with the Camden.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you say that you can measure clean, because clean is just linearity. It is what goes in is what comes out, but a lot louder, right? Whereas that color or the character of a preamp, that's a little bit more subjective. I'm interested to hear, Ed, your perspective on what generally are some components that add color, and what is this color that's being added?
Right. Well, that's a multifaceted answer. Really, there's quite a few things that'll add to that. So you've got, the ones that everyone usually goes to are the harmonics. Obviously, you've got not just the amount of second versus third harmonics and when they come in, and the amount they come in. You've got the ratio between them. You've got the frequencies across the bandwidth, where you might find that you have different combinations of harmonics from the low end to the high end. Obviously there's a lot of analog gear also provides color with some kind of EQ-like effect, reinforcing or, compressing or attenuating some frequencies. And then you also have some color comes from phase distortion as well. So if you have the low-end frequencies have a fair amount of roll-off, say just under 20 hertz, you'll end up with quite a lot of phase distortion at that low end, which will then smear out the transients of your low frequencies over some period of milliseconds, which is audible as this lack of focus, and that doesn't even get into various other effects like slew rate limiting, and there's a list I could go down that's 100 pieces long.
The one thing I would say, Kyle, is you said about distortion and it being subjective. So what is subjective about it is how pleasing that distortion sounds. But what is objective is we can measure all of this distortion. So, add any tube piece of gear, transformer gear, anything you want, we can find out exactly how much THD, which is total harmonic distortion, is being added to the signal when you run it through that. We could see exactly at what frequencies that's happening at. We could see the phase, like Ed was talking about phase distortion. We could see the phase distortion, the phase shift. We can measure all of this stuff. Whether it's pleasing sounding is another thing. We can just simply say, is it there or is it not? But it's down to subjective listening tests to determine whether that's pleasing. Like, for instance, a lot of transformers sound absolutely fantastic. They add stuff at 5K, at 60 hertz, wherever they add, that just sounds lovely. 200 hertz, wherever it is. And that is something that's very much subjective. And in terms of, you asked Ed, distortion, sources of distortion. Yeah, they're numerous, as Ed kind of pointed out. But and that's just going. If you go into the circuit, like any op amp, any transistor, anything has the chance to add distortion and to add phase and stuff like that. But if we're talking about the big things, basically transformers and tubes in this sort of gear, it are the main sources of distortion, and both pleasing and otherwise. So just harmonic distortion, THD, the two main sources in the sort of outboard gear that we like to use are tubes and transformers.
And that's kind of what I was going for. So that's really helpful. It seems that there are, like Ed said, these different types of distortion that can occur. Harmonic distortion, how much of it, at what frequencies, and what are the balance of even order or odd order harmonics. And then you said even some phase shifts, and like Ed said, that can sometimes result in smearing. And even that smearing probably could, getting to what you said, Sean, be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on what you're recording.
It can sound good. It can sound good, honestly, Kyle.
That actually leads me to my next question, which is, what are some situations where you might want clean versus character, or vice versa?
That is, like, we leave it totally in the hands of the engineers and the people using the kit. That's a better question for people who do, like, for instance, orchestral recording. Those guys like clean preamps, because you're trying to capture a room sound, the natural timbre of acoustic instruments. That's something that you probably don't want, like, vibey, tubey, transformer-y stuff to do. You want to keep that clean because it's such complex waveforms, and especially when you're starting orchestras, that is a very complex soundstage. And if you start using stuff that colors that stuff, it's gonna get out of hand pretty quickly because it's just such rich harmonic content. What you typically want transformers and tubey stuff on, like stuff that's gonna add this distortion and stuff like that, it's typically on stuff that you want to please, that you want to embellish, a source that you want to thicken up, vibing up, lively up. That could be anything from a mix, an individual track, a kick drum, a voice. I mean, anything. I guess if we look at transformers specifically, the two you have Ed talked about this. You have the EQ style curves, which is basically a boost in frequency response at certain frequencies, which transformers can do, which as a byproduct of their physical materials. You also have THD. They introduce THD at certain frequencies. Again, that can be pleasing. And then we talked about the phase shift that can happen. So as an example, let's say, so all transformers will have a little bit of phase shift because in the audio band, because they're not full. Basically, they only operate in the audio range, 20 hertz to 20K, because making a transformer big enough to go bigger than that is problematic. I mean, really high-end transformers can probably do it, but not the ones you typically see in audio equipment currently. And I mean, I've measured transformer preamps that have 60 degrees of phase shift at 50 hertz, 90 degrees of phase shift at 50 hertz. Now think about that. 90 degrees of phase shift at 60 hertz means that your low end is arriving 5 milliseconds later than 1K. So why would that sound good? Well, it sounds good because it sounds fatter. It's like rounding out the transient. It turns like a really punchy, quick transient into something that's thicker. It takes more time for your ear to perceive it, which makes it sound bigger, fatter, wider. And also the high frequencies will arrive before the low frequencies. So you get a little bit of beater, the kick drum beater before you get like the low end, which again can be pleasing, so you get the attack up front, but then you get this like and again, subjectively speaking, that can sound pleasing. But for people that don't want that phase shift, they just want really accurate, you want as little phase shift as possible.
I love what you're saying, which is distortion isn't necessarily bad. And in reality, distortion is sort of the magic of analog gear. So though there's some clean analog gear, there's also some pretty cool analog gear that does something to the signal. It's not perfectly transparent or perfectly lets the signal pass through. It does distort it. That gets me into another really cool product you guys have, which is, I think, your newest product, the Carnaby 500. That's a harmonic EQ. I saw you guys demonstrate this at the NAMM show last year. Really cool stuff. Explain how that also uses saturation, harmonic distortion in a way that hasn't really been done before.
Right. So yeah, it does something very odd. It creates this EQ effect by adding and subtracting, harmonic content generated from, band limited frequencies. So you end up being able to tune the amount of second and third order harmonics and the onset where they come in, and maybe you have the second and thirds coming in at different points with it for each of the three different bands, and it can vary across the frequency ranges for the frequency bands that the harmonic EQ is setting as well. So what we really actually come up with is something that allows you to really tune that timbre however you like, however you want to do for the source. So it's almost like having an infinite range of analog gear, all with their own very particular saturations which suit particular sources, but you can tune to taste.
I love that, because a lot of people think EQ, and when they think of frequencies, they think, okay, I play an A on my guitar, or maybe that's 220 hertz. And so they're saying, if I want to make that note louder, I need to EQ 220 hertz. And not necessarily, because even though I'm playing a fundamental frequency, 220 hertz on my guitar, it's going to create a second harmonic at 440 hertz. And a third harmonic at 660 hertz, and so on.
It's going to do a lot more than that, Kyle. It's going to have so much. An acoustic guitar creates so much harmonic content. Yeah, exactly. From the resonances and that's down to the cavity of the acoustic cavity, the chamber, the bracing of the acoustic guitar. Any acoustic instrument has a very rich sonic field because, if you were to hear a 1K tone like sine tones, they're not harmonically rich. It's one piercing, awful tone. Whereas anything that's pleasing sounding, this is synthesizers, drums, acoustics, very rich signals. And it's not just, you were talking about the octaves, right? So 220 hertz will make 440 hertz, will make 880 hertz, and they'll decrease as they go up the octaves. But the thing is, you'll also get, especially acoustic instruments, you're going to get stuff all over the place. All you have to do is if you have a DAW, look at an analyzer and just strum a note on your acoustic guitar and look how much frequency content is generated. So just go. I think I know where you're going with the EQ content, but basically, in the world of non-sine waves, in the world of real acoustic instruments and even synthesizers and stuff like that, there's a lot of frequency content. Like A440 is not just 440. It's a lot of stuff.
So we can use this EQ not to just bring up that fundamental or even bring up the existing harmonics that exist in that signal, but we can use it to sort of enrich that signal and create more harmonic distortion that wasn't there. And this word distortion sort of scares people off, getting back to that again. But if you want to think about it as analog magic, you can as well. If you want to think about it as sweetness or richness, those are all synonyms that have been used to describe what is fundamentally the same thing, which is character.
Although not all THD is pleasing. That's the issue, though, Kyle. So all THD is distortion. Some of it is pleasing. Some of it is not. A lot of it is not. In fact, yeah. Ed just said the majority is not, and he's right. So you're right. There's two types of THD, and the problem is we can't measure that. We can measure how much THD there is in a signal, but we can't tell you whether it sounds good or bad. Only your ears can really do that, which is the tricky of it. And yeah, you're right. Distortion. If you're talking about somebody like Ed who designs electronic circuits, like he's talking distortion, he just means what I'm putting in is not what I'm getting out. There's added stuff. There's distortion. But in the terms of an audio guy, an audio engineer, a producer, and a musician, distortion just means that analog thing is doing stuff and it's affecting the signal effectively.
So how might one think about using the harmonic EQ, the Carnaby 500, versus a more traditional EQ?
Well, it's like almost a completely different tool. Now, the reason why we made it like an EQ, we called it an EQ, is because it works like an EQ. The interface is like an EQ. It's 3 bands with a boost and a cut and a frequency control. So it's just like a parametric EQ. So in terms of user interface, it is like an EQ. However, the effects and how you'd employ it on a track, totally different. So an EQ will adjust the amplitude, the volume of frequencies. So, you choose, it has a curve, right? So use your 220 or 440 example, right? So let's say we have a center frequency of 220 and the Q is like 1.5, 1, whatever, so it's a little wide, and you have a boost and a cut. So if you boost at 6 dBs or cut at 6 dBs, what you're doing is you're using phase to you're when it's in phase, it's boosting. When it's out of phase, it's cutting, and it's just simply adding or subtracting volume of that frequency and the surrounding range, whatever you have the bandwidth set to, the Q set to. The Carnaby, our harmonic equalization does not work like this. It is band limited. So, for instance, in the same way that a traditional EQ would have a Q and a certain range that it works in, Carnaby works in the same manner, but it's not adjusting the volume of the source material. In that band, it's adding how much. It's saying how much do you want. How do you want to add the harmonics? Do you want to boost all harmonics in this band and the fundamental, or do you want to cut the fundamental and put harmonics in its place? So, like, totally different from a traditional EQ. EQs are still, you'll always need EQs because EQs are effectively volume adjustments, Whereas Carnaby and harmonic equalization, it's changing the character of the instrument. It's changing the signal. It's enriching the signal. So it's not making a volume adjustment. That's actually one of the great things about Carnaby is it doesn't really change the volume. Even if you make a big cut, it's not really going to change the volume because it's going to make harmonics in its place. So there's still a place for equalization on top of the Carnaby. It's not going to replace an equalizer, but what it will do is it'll give you a whole totally new tool to create tone within 3 bands, like how an equalizer does.
This brings me back to a concept that Paul Willie Green Womack shared with me during a podcast interview, which is your cell phone is never going to reproduce that sub bass that rattles your trunk. And a lot of people, I have a video on how to make your mixes translate. And one element of that video is to test on different speakers. Because let's face it, a lot of people listen to your music on a small Bluetooth speaker or other speakers that are challenged in their ability to create bass. And the intuitive thing would be, okay, well, if the frequency response is very tailored to reduce bass, then I just need to make my music bassier, boost those low frequencies, and it'll come across on those speakers. But the truth is, no matter how much you boost 50 hertz, your cell phone is never going to reproduce 50 hertz. And then Paul Womack gave me a tip that was brilliant that I had never even thought of, which is what we can do instead is use harmonic distortion, use saturation, to saturate that 50 hertz low bass and create 100 hertz, 150 hertz, 200 hertz, and so on, so that the person listening on the phone, though they won't hear the actual 50 hertz fundamental, something in their brain will tell them that something's happening down there because they hear the harmonics that are above that. So that seems like a perfect application for the Carnaby 500.
That is exactly like the low end. That's exactly what it's great at. So like if you were to set, I think the lowest setting is 20 hertz on the frequency setting. It goes up to 420. But if you were to use it, say 40, 50, 60, what it's going to do is it's going to reduce that fundamental, but it's going to create harmonics of that. And yeah, up into 200 hertz, 300 hertz, 400 hertz. In fact, the thump band goes all the way up. How high will it affect, Ed? Up into like 800 hertz even. It'll still be adding content. Yeah, it'll still be doing stuff. So, and the one thing I would say though, Kyle, it's actually not a trick. It's not tricking your brain, because what it's doing is it's taking the sound of something that's only happening at 50 hertz, and it's creating the overtones of it. It's creating the harmonics of it. So what it's doing is it's taking the energy, I'll put it this way: it's taking the action that occurs only in that bit of the frequency range, and it's making that action occur higher up in the frequency range as well. So that bass drum hit at 60 hertz. That's only at 60 hertz in the original material. It's now at 120, at 240, and at 480 as well. But not as a trick. That energy is there. Now you can hear it even on laptop speakers because it's been recreated further up in the audio spectrum, and it's reminiscent. It's okay. It doesn't have obviously anyone who's any audio engineer who's done like the classic thing of like name that tone where you play sine tones and you can hear them. I don't know if maybe I'm weird. I guess I'm an old school engineer, so I used to play that game with my friends. But basically, I could tell you what 1K sounds like. I could tell you what 200 hertz sounds like. But the key is that like a kick drum, like anything that's musical, anything that's real, musical content, that's not a sine tone and all the rest of it. It's an event that's occurring in a track, right? So that 60 hertz hit. Now that hit is happening at a frequency that you can hear. So it's while it won't have the same tone You know, it won't have the same low end thump that very visceral thing that a big sub bass will have. It will recreate that energy in this frequency range where the speakers can reproduce that frequency.
That's incredible. It's such an awesome tool. And it really takes, we're going to create a piece of analog equipment. What is very special about analog and really can be done the best in analog domain? Let's do that. What I think is awesome is that most innovations that you see these days are being made in the digital realm. It's actually been a while since we've seen new analog circuits come around. In audio, that is, right?
I mean, this industry has existed for 100 years. There's, there's everything that's out there has been done to death 1,000 times in 1,000 different ways. So, I mean, it's probably been at least a few decades since we really saw something new.
Yeah, I mean, like we always say that the Carnaby harmonic EQ is the first new analog audio signal processing circuit in a few decades. The last like truly new circuit, I mean, like totally never been done before that we're aware of before the Carnaby is the rail exciter in the late 80s. And then obviously you have more exciters that came out afterwards, but that was the first like new circuit. Because everything we have, compressors, EQs, like, inductors became gyrators, but it's the same physical it's phase equalizing a signal. A compressor is, okay, you have FET compressors, you have tube compressors, you have VCA compressors, but they're doing the same thing effectively. They are different and they work differently, but it's an evolution. New compressors are generally an evolution of previous designs. Whereas, as far as we're aware, the harmonic, this is the first totally new audio circuit in a few decades. So yeah, and I guess we did it. I don't know. We did it because obviously we want to innovate. We like doing this, but also we like coming at problems like it's not like what should we make. It's more like what problems are there. Like what could we do? Like how do you solve? Like this is a problem in my mixes, in my masters, in my studio, in my recording sessions. What would fix that? What would be great? That's where we start designing products. We don't have an idea of what we want to make. We have an idea of what solutions we want to fix, if you follow me. So basically the reason why Carnaby was possible is we learned a lot about analog saturation through the evolution of the Camden's Mojo circuit, analog saturation circuit. And, and we got a lot of great feedback from engineers that tried Camden's, things that we didn't expect people to use it on, they used it on, they found it useful for. And then obviously people say, wouldn't it be great if we could do this? Or wouldn't it be great if you guys had a way of doing this? And then we went off and figured out what we can do. It took us 4 or 5 years to kind of to work through all of that and to actually get something that was ready for production and ready to go into people's hands.
I think it was actually you, Sean, who at the NAMM show mentioned this to me, which is that analog does some things better, digital does other things better, and they're both great tools. Can you talk more about that concept?
Yeah, I mean, Ed will agree with me completely. So first of all, the best EQs in the world are in terms of doing the thing perfectly and giving you loads of controls. You're not going to beat a linear phase EQ in a DAW. It's just, they're incredible. DSP is so powerful. You could get any frequency value you want. You can get any dB value you want. I mean, the amount of precise control you have is unmatched in the digital realm. And yeah, I mean, DSP is very powerful. It can do transformations. It can do equalization, compression, whatever you want. Cleanest compressor, a DSP compressor can be very clean and cleaner or just as clean as the cleanest analog compressor. And with a lot more fine control. And you have things like look ahead, right? Because you have in a DAW you have a recorded track, so it can look ahead on that recorded track and say, I predict this is going to happen. Or this is coming in, this signal's about to hit my DSP, I will pre-compensate for that. I will apply this compression there. That's how you get brick wall limiting and stuff in DAWs and stuff like that. So yeah, I mean, plugins are incredible, especially I think plugin developers that they have unlimited GUIs. There's so much stuff they can do. There's a lot of fantastic plugins being made these days.
Perfect matching.
Perfect matching is another example. Any other you can think of, Ed?
It's the one that's off the top of my head.
Yeah, there's just so many. There's so many great things about plugins. Digital's incredible, and especially like if you think about a plugin, it's not hardware, so you're not limited by physical stuff, so you can have 20 instances of a plugin, perfect recall as soon as you load the DAW. I mean, it's unbelievable the convenience and how awesome it is. And you can go anywhere in the world, bring your laptop, you have your full studio. It's incredible. It's absolutely brilliant. Plugins are fantastic. But the one thing, this holds up in blind listening tests, this holds up in our tests, this holds up in terms of what people, when they buy our equipment or buy other analog equipment, what they say. Analog has a sound that is just perfect. It's just magical. And it just is. I don't know why, Kyle. I don't know why electrons running through copper sound so much better than ones and zeros. I don't exactly understand it. I don't exactly know. It's very chaotic. There's a lot to it, but it just does. Now, what I'd say is if you use 8 to 10 to 12 plugins and you're really good at them and you know them inside and out, you could pretty much get any sound you could, like the most beautiful saturated sound that you've ever gotten on a piece of analog equipment. You could probably get 98% of there, 99% there with enough tweaking and enough time, But what analog's really great at is vibe. If you just take a signal and run it through it, it just has a sound and it like immediately sounds good. So that's why I like to use analog equipment during the tracking phase, actually. A lot of people these days don't like to track with a lot of processing. What I go the other way. I like to track with processing, but just not a lot of processing. I think of tracking as the vibe. Like this is the time for me to get a good performance from the vocalists, from the drummers, from the guitarists, get the sound or get a good sound, a good rough sound that they're pleased with, that inspires their performance, and it gives it a character. Then I'll go and do the surgical stuff later in the mixdown phase, almost exclusively through plugins, maybe some outboard equipment, because it's just for certain things. But that's your typical hybrid workflow these days. I mean, people use the best bits of analog where they think it's the best. I'll give you an example. A lot of master engineers, like it's a full analog chain because they think they can get better quality going through analog. And maybe they're right. Maybe I don't know. It's up to them to decide. Mix engineers, a lot of mix engineers will swear by certain pieces of hardware that it's like their secret sauce, and they'll run it out of the DAW, run stems, whatever, into hardware, and then come back in. Other people, and I'm talking about some of the biggest engineers in the world, are like exclusively plugins now, almost exclusively plugins. Now, they have to have some analog outboard because in order to record an equipment, it has to go from a transducer, like a microphone, into an amplifier, a preamp, into line level inputs on a converter, into an A to D stage. So there's still, even when you completely go plugins, if you're completely plugins, you still have a lot of analog hardware that you're using. The preamps and the conversions, stuff like that. So what is analog good at? Analog's not good at being perfect. Typically, I mean, aside from like transformerless preamps and really transparent preamps and really high-end converters. But if you're talking about equalizers and compressors, people don't revere pieces of analog hardware because of, when you're talking about compressors and EQs, typically because they're clean. They like it because there's a character to them. They have a sound. So that's where I feel like analog is vibe and color, and digital is precision, generally.
And like you said, the digital can probably, with enough time and skill, mimic what that vibe that analog just does automatically does, right? You could probably make a model, and many have made models of legendary 1176s, LA2As that give that vibe, but that's a lot of processing, that's a lot of programming that goes into that. Whereas you run your signal through a character preamp, and it's just going to automatically give you that distortion that we've grown accustomed to over years and years of listening to music, right? You hear Sam Cooke go a little bit heavier into the mic. You hear Ray Charles go a little bit heavier into the mic and into the preamp and into the input of the tape machine and onto the tape itself. And all of those stages react the way that they react because that's all we ever used was analog gear. And now when someone goes a little heavier into the mic, digital will just be completely linear all the way up to and beyond 0 dB full scale. And we're like, hey man, what's missing? Where's that distortion? Where's that richness that I'm used to hearing? And that's where I think analog it's like almost an easy button. You put a signal through that analog piece of gear, and you know that if it's designed properly, if you overdrive it, if you take it to its limits, it's going to give you that sweetness that you've grown to love.
Even if you drive it into clipping, absolutely, it's going to add a lot of richness. But a lot of analog equipment just still, like I'll give you an example, compressors. Like you don't have to be driving it hard. Like let's say a really well-revered Varimu compressor, something like an RS-124 or a Stahl Level or one of these epic, classic Varimu compressors that are like or Fairchilds, right? Like these iconic pieces of kit. You don't have to be driving them anywhere near clip, but the Varimu properties of that compression ratio is so chaotic that it is next to impossible to replicate in DSP. I say next to impossible. I'm sure somebody spent so long doing it, but my point is that what is affecting something like a vari-mu ratio of a compressor, that is such a chaotic thing. That's such an there's so many variables. I like literally tens of thousands that go into that circuit that affect that temperature, humidity, so many things, or optical circuits, opto compressors, same thing, right? Like a big thing about optical compressors is like, oh, what opto cell are you using? Are you using the original one? Because that's what's going to give it the ballistics. That's what's going to give it the time constants that sound pleasing, And so, yeah, I mean, it basically analog gear, everything has a sound because of reasons, because the electronic circuits are not perfect, and there's interactions happening, thousands of interactions happening in a circuit that give it a sound. And the challenge for DSP developers is, do you mimic the effect, as in like, I have one piece of kit that sounds great. I'm going to mimic that THD curve. I'm going to mimic that phase curve. I'm going to mimic that ratio curve when I run this source through it, because everyone says that sounds great. I'm going to apply that. That's what I'm going to write DSP to do that. Or you can do the physical modeling approach, where you model the circuit, which I don't understand how people do this, because there's too many things to factor in, but they do it. So they do physical modeling, where they basically reconstruct the physical circuit and all the interdependencies and all the imperfect things and all the, they do all of that and then write DSP for that. So that's very challenging. I don't, there's some companies that do that, which is amazing. I don't understand how they can do all of the possible physical interactions, just because we know how many there are. I mean, they're just so innumerous.
You can, even with the top of the line simulation tools that I use to actually design things, that doesn't capture every parameter of every part, and sometimes that matters. Sometimes you end up with something that's really quite different when you build it on the bench as to how it went on simulations. It doesn't matter how good your models, of each part, even when you're modeling literally every single transistor, resistor, capacitor in the circuit. Those models are never perfect, and you can have hundreds of parts. You're not going to be able to go through and measure all of these parameters that may not even be entirely understood to get a perfect physical model. It's just not possible. You can get close, but you can't get 100% perfect.
But a lot of these physical models sound good, so they've probably done enough to capture what most people think is, relevant. So, it's down to subjectivity. Whenever you're talking about this sort of pleasing distortion or what this box sounds like or something like that, man, it's tricky. There's a fine line between snake oil and and real, but as well, so it's plugin developers have a hard job. I think making a perfect plugin that sounds great and has all sorts of parameters, that's kind of easy. I think the real challenge is like recreating analog gear. That is just so hard to do, and hard because you can even do a great job of it, and people cannot think you've done a great job of it. And equally, you could have cut corners, but people say, "Hey, it sounds good on this," and it reminds me of this. So it's just a tough thing. Whereas what's great about analog is it's the thing. The circuit is the thing. You're using that op amp there. You're using that transistor there. You're using that transformer there. So as chaotic as it is, as long as you're always using the same parts, it's going to be the thing. It's going to be that thing. And that's why a lot of people, if you're talking about old analog hardware, a lot of people are really specific about what components they're using. Oh, are you using the original optocell? Are you using the original tubes? Are you using new old stock tubes? Are you using, did you get new old stock op amps? Did you get new old stock germanium diodes? These are the things these are the little subtle differences that make the character and make the sound of these boxes. So it's a minefield.
And I think that we've established then that there are reasons to use digital. If you want something perfect, there's a whole list of reasons to use digital, there's a whole list of reasons to use analog, which means that hybrid mixing is a very effective way to go. Hybrid mixing meaning that you're using some plugins in the box, and then you're sending that audio out through some analog gear, bringing it back in, maybe doing some more with plugins. When you're doing that, however, you're going to be sending from digital to analog to digital, back and forth, and you're going to be running through an A to D converter and a D to A converter, probably repeatedly. With that being said, what is the importance of a high quality converter in a hybrid mixing setup?
Okay, so I'll start with the application side. So basically, every pass you do, you're going to be adding noise and distortion. And the problem with converter distortion, it's typically not the nice kind of distortion. It's clipping filters, clipping in converters, or even worse, full scale digital clipping is bad. It doesn't sound good. You just converter distortion is typically not nice. There are exceptions, but but it's typically not very nice. And then noise floor as well. So every pass you do is probably going to add a little bit of noise, depending, because 140 dB is a perfect, 24-bit audio can do 140 dB, but you're not going to get any converter that has 140 dB of usable range. So you'll be squashing the dynamic range. Now the thing is, you don't need, take the 500 R8. The 500 R8 has 121 dB signal noise ratio, 121 dB dynamic range. I mean, that's so much. You could do many passes before noise starts becoming an issue. But if you're using a converter that only has 100 dB of dynamic range or 105 dB of dynamic range, every pass you do, it's going to build the noise floor, and let alone before we even discuss distortion. So, the 500 R8 achieves a THD number of like 112 dB THD plus N. That's lower than some interfaces noise floors, dynamic range. If you want to avoid converter distortion, that's the other really important number to look at is converter THD. So I would say 110 or above is kind of what you want for really high-end conversion, high-end mixing and mastering conversion. But if you're going to do multiple passes of hybrid mixing, you definitely want to make sure you use something that achieves that. Now, the nice thing is converters have gotten so much better over the years. Even entry-level converters these days are pretty decent, but obviously you get what you pay for. So really high-end converters will make the difference. They will introduce less distortion and they'll have more dynamic range.
And like you said, if you're just doing one microphone, it's probably not going to be that big of a deal. But if you're doing 32 tracks, if you're sending those tracks in and out of the DAW, quantizing and converting back to analog again and again, these things can start to add up. And that also actually reminds me of another feature in your 500 chassis, the chain switch that sort of allows you to send out once to an analog device, and then instead of coming back in and sending back out to the next analog device, you can just chain those two together and sort of make a channel strip so that you have one conversion that goes out to the analog domain. You go through the analog gear you want to use, and then you convert it back only once. That also has some implications for latency as well, of course.
Well, and what I love most about the chain switch is that it gives you an undo. Like, for instance, let's say you have 3 500 series slots. You have a preamp, an EQ, and a compressor in that order. Chain. But you can record all 3 tracks. So you can record just the preamp, then you can record the preamp and the EQ, and then you can record the preamp, the EQ, and the compressor. And then it's like an undo later in your recording. So that's why, like, I talked earlier about how I track with compression and EQ now. But that's why I have an R8 and ADAT when I'm recording, and I'll just record all the channels. If I'm recording a vocalist, I'll have the preamp, and plus EQ, and I'll have the preamp, EQ, and compressor. If I overcook the compressor, no big deal. Go back to the preamp and the EQ. But the cool thing is I would have gotten the performance from the vocalist with the compression, because especially vocalists, like, they will respond to the compression, they like good vocalists, especially, they're very mindful of how they sound. So the performance will change. I've had it where I used to do it the other way, where I used to record super clean, and you get a good performance, especially when you have a good musician. That's, musicians make the best recordings, let's face it. But when you get a recording that, especially if you want to get soul into something, or if you want to bring it to that next level, well, applying analog gear and getting them a sound immediately, the performer getting them a sound which boldens them and makes them feel good and makes them, wow, I can't believe how good I sound, and I can interact with it. For instance, like, there's some compressors that add a little bit of 6K, 7K, which is like the S's in their voice. That could sound good, that could sound bad. Other compressors have a lot of body at 2K, which will inspire some singers and say, wow, I can really belt this part out. So it's crucial to the performance as well. That's why the chain feature is so great, I think, as well. But one of the things that we were talking about with the converter specs and stuff, Kyle, is you don't have to do multiple passes. You can do the whole chain all at once on one converter pass and save your dynamic range and your THD and everything for the mixing stage. Another thing you mentioned about when you're doing the converter specs come into play when you're doing multiple passes and stuff like that. Actually, they even come into play with plugins, because plugins have oversampling and stuff like that. So that out of band noise that Ed was showing, that can come into play on plugins as well. Plugins that do oversampling and push the Nyquist up and do more out of band, processing where intermodulation distortion becomes an issue and stuff like that. So, you have a converter which has more of that high frequency noise and that kind of stuff. That could affect your plugins, that use oversampling and high frequency kind of sampling and stuff like that. So just generally speaking, the better the quality of your converter signal is, it's downstream. Everything from that point on will be cleaner, more dynamic, and you could do more passes and you could do more processing without artifacts becoming an issue.
You guys have definitely made a name for yourself when it comes to high quality at every stage of the signal chain. And I love that. You also have a way of putting several different functions together into one box. You were sort of getting to that where this 500 chassis isn't just a 500 chassis. It's a monitor mixer. It's a channel strip if you want it to be. It's a whole lot of things. Can you give some examples of how and why you do that sort of thing?
Yeah. So, I mean, 508, we call it a studio in a box. Like, what is it? I don't know. It depends what you want it to be. It could be an 8-slot summing mixer, 8-slot 500 series summing mixer only, analog only. You could use it as your main audio interface. You could use it as like a foldback cue mixer for recording. I mean, there's just so many applications you can use it as, and that's because it's flexible. We try to build maximum flexibility into the products. We, like, for instance, on the 500RA, all the analog pads are exposed. You can go in and out. Like, we have the inserts per channel. We have various outputs and stuff on each direct outputs on each slot. We just expose everything. And because people work in different ways, we want to facilitate as much creativity, as many different workflows as possible. So that's why we try to load stuff up. Now, in terms of product design, why we do that, it's actually really simple. Like, there's fixed costs in the product. A metal chassis costs what a metal chassis costs. A power supply costs what a power supply costs. You know, if you have a preamp that requires a power supply, and a compressor that requires a power supply, and a converter that requires a power supply, and a monitor controller that requires a power supply, you know, that just in power supplies alone, you're spending a lot of money. You know, whereas if you have one box that has one power supply, one chassis, but it does 10 different things, we pass that savings on, right? We make the savings. You know, we don't have multiple power supplies, we don't have multiple chassis. So it's not like we're trying to make more money. We just reduce the price of the unit because we're not duplicating all those physical costs. And yeah, I mean, but the real reason, it's not like we're we want to make cost-effective products that perform really high level. That's one of our big things that we try to accomplish. But the number one thing we want to accomplish is people work in different ways. We don't assume we know the best way to work. We don't assume there is a best way to work. You know, mixing, mastering, mastering especially, I think, they're all creative processes. You know, the engineer will have their flavor, their tone, their way of working. And all we want to do is we want to be able to facilitate for them to work the way they are, not impose a way of working onto them. And so we just try to build maximum flexibility into the units. And again, the more flexible we make each unit, the more possible use cases are for it. So the more units will be out there because it's flexible. So it's just generally a thing we strive to do. But then again, it can go the other way. Like, for instance, some people say on our Camden EC1 or our Camden EC2, hey, I don't need a headphone amps. I have headphone amps. I'm paying for these. I don't need them. That's kind of not the way we look at it, because the way we look at it is it's already got a metal chassis. It's already got a power supply. It's got space on the front panel. We might as well, for the sake of $20, add a headphone amp or whatever it is. That's. But some people feel like they're paying for stuff that they're not using. But that's not the reality. Basically, that extra headphone amp and that EC2 is not costing that much money. Okay, you don't use it, fine. You don't need to use it, but maybe one day it will come in handy. Like, as an example, on my EC2, when I mic stuff in a room, I found it to be dead useful. Like, if I'm trying to find the sweet spot, trying to put an SM57 off axis on a guitar cabinet, rather than having to run back and forth to control room, I can just plug my headphones right into my EC2 right there and make real-time adjustments and hear it right away. I mean, like, that's just one small example. So yeah, there's downsides maybe to doing it our way, but I think there's more upsides than downsides.
If you're already familiar with hybrid mixing, make sure you check out some of Cranborne Audio's gear. But if you're interested in starting to introduce analog gear into your already existing digital workflow, you can watch the video that's on your screen now, where you'll see the 500 ADAT in action, or you can find that video in the link below. Thank you guys so much for joining me. It was very enlightening, and I hope that the viewers will think the same.
I hope we didn't overscience you guys. The lovely bit of audio is the magic. I hope we didn't demystify it too much.